All right. Good morning and welcome back. You enjoyed your cold weekend. It's gonna stay cold. So we kind of ended in the midst of talking about conduct, justification and conduct of war. We ended last class talking about the conditions for entering into war. You remember the Latin phrase that was associated with. They both start with use at least.
Entering into war urges bello.
Ad bellum, yes. Which literally means, yes, the justification to war, into war. We talked about the four different conditions that must be satisfied in order to say that a war is just to enter into. What was one of the four criteria, right? Well, one of the four criteria, not what was a just war, perhaps. What was one of the four criteria to say one can enter into a just war? Just cause, right? Next.
Last resort.
Last resort. Probability of success. Last one. Comparative justice, right. So those are the four criteria that must be met to enter into a just war. However, it is one thing to enter into war, however just it may be. It is another to carry out the war. This will we look at in today's class. So there's entering into war, jus ad bellum, and then there's the conduct in war, jus in bello. Why? Because the moral law is not excused in war. Just because one must offer violent resistance to injustice does not mean one gets a free pass to do whatever one wants. So how is it nations and even individuals must conduct themselves in the execution of war? We already saw two of those criteria. We talked about the kind of two basic positions that the Catholic moral tradition allows in the conduct of war. The first is discrimination, or sometimes put differently, immunity. The principle of discrimination or immunity in war is that non-combatants, those who are not actively engaged in war, are treated humanely, or if at all possible, avoided. So this includes the general public. This includes the wounded. This includes prisoners of war. That, in other words, combat must be restricted between soldiers. Though the area of combat may expand at times, and in general, combat should be restricted to happening between soldiers. One should not be engaging non-combatants. You must discriminate against them or to hold them as being immune to war, immune to battle, at least. The other principle we've already looked at is proportionality. That the use of military force in carrying out this war, the use of violent resistance, must be enough needed to obtain the objectives of the war, without disproportionate collateral damage. The use of military force must be enough needed to meet the objectives without unnecessary or disproportionate collateral damage. So of old, they would more often than not fight in fields far away from towns, rather than in fighting in the midst of cities. I'm not saying that happened every single time, but more often than not, that was the case. To avoid damaging as much outside of the combat area as possible. Whether fields, whether homes, whether other cities and towns themselves. So, discrimination or immunity, proportionality. The last one, the maintenance of right intention. What is the ultimate aim of going to war? Why do we justify going to war usually? There's injustice, there's disturbance in the peace. So we want to reestablish peace with justice. That is the continuous aim of the war, to maintain that right intention, to restore peace with justice. In other words, acts of vengeance or indiscriminate violence are forbidden. You don't, even if you were the one who was attacked, you do not go and attack the other one as an act of vengeance. Nor do you engage in violence indiscriminately. So these three principles help us to understand how it is we ought to and must conduct ourselves in war as nations and even as individuals. Why? Even though one may be a soldier in the military, in the army, one still has a conscience that one must be responsible to. Ultimately, we say the ultimate authority to go before, but at a minimum, at least your conscience. And more so with soldiers than any other occupation. Their consciences pings them or pains them very often after battle. We talk about that a lot more than perhaps our grandparents' generation did after World War II. But it's very true. Now, the biggest way to see this, to look at all of this, is to look at the largest example of conduct in war, of how one conducts this war. And that's, of course, looking at the example of the active use of the atomic bomb. To date, there has only been 2 atomic bombs exploded in an action of war versus what's so-called peacetime demonstrations or testing. The 2, of course, are the 2 times the United States dropped 2 bombs on Japan. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. August 6th and August 9th, 1945. Some statistics to help understand the impact of the use of these weapons. At Hiroshima, it was said that between 140,000 people were casualties just in 1945, either severely wounded, irradiated, or killed. Nagasaki, the accounts are between 60 to 80,000. These events also had a minor cultural impact in Japan itself, of those who were affected, those who lived in those cities and were affected by them. They were called the hibakusha, the explosion afflicted people. As of August of last year, there were 510,000 who were memorialized. Why? Because they were seen in certain ways almost as being poisonous. Yes, because of there was the fear that they were still irradiated in some way. I mean, perhaps they had a radiation sickness. So many of them struggled to be able to live in society. They struggled to be able to hold down jobs or get married or have families because they were so negatively viewed. They're viewed almost like lepers, carrying this disease that was going to affect others. So, to understand this, we ought to look at it, to judge the use of these weapons or potential use of these weapons. Even though the Cold War is still ended and done, there's still the threat of that being used by others. Does the use of the atomic bomb satisfy any conditions of discrimination or immunity? Who says yes? Who says no?
The only conditional possibility there, if it being yes, is if you have a more desert type country like Iran, with like a government structure that it, like after an attack has already been carried out and they were in warfare, it's isolated from the population of innocent people.
Perhaps. How really likely is that, though? How really likely is it that it will only be used in an area that is just combatants?
Not very likely.
The atomic bombs that were dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki are technically some of the weakest forms of the atomic bomb, especially today. And so there are bombs that have far greater reach, far greater impact. So it's harder to say that there can be discrimination or immunity through the use of that. Sorry, question.
Wasn't one of them, didn't they have a military site like in the city? I sort of like, it was either Hiroshima or Nagasaki that they had a military.
There are some debate about that, but we can also look at that perhaps in the question of proportionality as well. But going to that one as well, say there was major military production in either of those cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Does that warrant the complete leveling of the town? Did the Allies, or especially the US, have the ability to target, more specifically, production sites such as that?
In terms of proportionality, could there be an argument made for the atom bombs based on what Japan, the Imperial Japan did in Manchuria?
Well,
genocide?
let's look at that. Let's look at that when we get to that.
Well,
Let's look at that when we get to that. Right now, looking at discrimination and immunity, is this going to really target only those who are actively, engaging in the war? Yeah.
well, the reason I asked wasn't the main reason that they did drop it, was that they figured that it would take millions of lives to invade the actual mainland Japan.
I think that kind of falls maybe a little bit more under proportionality. So we'll get back to that though. I'm not saying that one. I just want to focus on that. Would it have been possible for them to just target, or to target more precisely, I guess, those production facilities? Right. Yes. Who were most of those who were injured by it? Civilians, families, individuals far from combat, far from the front line. It could be argued, getting back, there could be an argument about the thoroughly militarized culture, though. That, the Japanese mentality kind of blurred the line, some Allied commanders argued. Why? Because there was a more fanatical, there was thought to be a more fanatical devotion to the national cause, to the emperor, things like that. That there were arguments that the Japanese high command was seeking to use even the weakest in the cause of war, even using infants or the elderly in some way. Such that the argument then was made that all the Japanese were combatants at that point. Yet, could it not be said of Americans in that as well? That Americans were doing the same? I mean, obviously we were not invaded, we were not attacked. Could it not be argued as well that every American was being shown to in some way be a combatant? You see propaganda that is spread about. They wanted people to conserve fuel, for example. So they didn't want people to ride alone. So there's a famous one. It's a drawing, of a man in a car by himself driving along the road. But you see kind of a ghost figure in the passenger seat. It's Hitler. It says, when you ride alone, you bring Hitler along with you. Something to the effect of, you're helping our enemies to win versus us to win. The famous pro women worker thing. Rosie the Riveter. We're going to get it all done, right? So there's not a strong case in the sense of discrimination or immunity. What about proportionality, though? I want to get back, first of all, to the big point you brought up about the worry about, what was the point? What was the main point of dropping these bombs? What were they trying to accomplish? What was the goal? What was the goal?
Conditional surrender.
To get Japan to surrender, right? They wanted Japan to surrender. What was the other choice that they had to force this surrender? If they didn't have these bombs, what other choice did they have? The other choice was seen as invasion, right? Japan is an island nation. So different conditions, say, from Germany, although we did have to invade Europe since Germany dominated pretty much all of it. But we would more so have to do that if we wanted to force the surrender of the Japanese. The argument went. So these were seen as the two most immediate ways to obtain that goal. The use of the atomic bomb versus an invasion. The argument is usually made that in planning, strategizing both of these out, that yes, the U.S. High Command said there would be probably about 100,000 affected by an atomic bomb. They absolutely acknowledged that. The argument they made, though, was that it would be far more in an invasion. Anywhere from 250 to 500,000 would be affected, or most likely killed, in a military invasion of the main islands. Yes?
Is that number, does that include like Japanese as well, or is that just American?
That is just Japanese.
Okay.
That is just Japanese.
Okay. Like civilians or
Just
total?
Japanese.
Okay.
Actually, I think that might just be like non-combatants. That might be civilians.
Okay.
Because obviously they recognized the atomic bomb is going to mostly just affect civilians. So the argument that one of the arguments often presented is that yes, the bomb is going to affect a lot of people, but not as many as an invasion. Another part, perhaps stemming over from that cultural difference, was the perceived culture of many of the people. What is the great kind of masculine image of Japanese culture? The samurai, the ancient warriors, right? Kind of the cowboys of Japan in a certain way, or knights, a little bit of both.
I think they're not.
Depends on the period. Depends on the period. Yeah, they're far enough back in medieval times. You could say knight-like, but still a presence even in the 19th century. So, another way, almost kind of cowboyish. That very virile image of the samurai. Part of the samurai kind of code was the idea of death was more to be desired than dishonor. That it was better to die than to lose your honor. Whether that was in battle or whether that was in suicide. So many in the U.S. and Allied Supreme Command were concerned that in making plans for an invasion and carrying out an invasion, that there would be massive casualties on the Allies' side because of this principle of death over dishonor. In fact, in preparation, and at first the plan was to go through with the invasion. In preparation for that, they began to manufacture Purple Hearts, which is the greatest sort of award a soldier can receive. It's an award given normally to those who die in the midst of battle. I believe they made at least 500,000 purple medals in preparation for the invasion. Obviously, the plans were switched and the invasion never did. They still use those Purple Hearts today. They've not manufactured Purple Hearts since the 40s. Even with the Korea, Vietnam, First Gulf War, Second Gulf War, our time in Afghanistan and all of that, they have not used up all of those Purple Hearts. However, these are not the only two possibilities for achieving an end of war. Any other ways that the end of the war could be achieved? What's another way?
Taking a look out of what would be the coming Cold War is just deposing the government through espionage. Not as easy, obviously very difficult, but possible.
Yes, I mean technically, but that was. I don't think that was still kind of the beginning of kind of espionage as a major political tool. So they didn't have the wherewithal or the know-how to really bring that about. So not saying they didn't perhaps entertain that, but they did not see that as really feasible anytime soon. Other ideas? Peace negotiations, right? To bring them forward to the table. Say, hey, we are where we're at now. Would you like to talk? Another one? Yeah, good one. Japan, more so than Germany, is completely an island country. What's easy to do to an island? To blockade it, to close it off, to not allow anything to go in. So in a certain sense, to kind of do a siege. And obviously a siege, which is a blockade. In fact, that was part of the reason Japan went to war, was to try to obtain more natural resources. Then later, to try to kind of push the United States out of the Pacific, which perhaps was their ultimate mistake. However, peace negotiations were seen as, in a certain way, incapable of doing it. Why? Because the American Supreme Command, American leaders, wanted an unconditional surrender. And peace negotiation would most likely not allow that to happen. A blockade was seen as possible, but again, those sort of cultural differences, they feared that it would still bring about many deaths, because the strong-willed nature of the Japanese meant that they would rather die. They still feared they would rather die rather than dishonor themselves by surrendering to foreigners, Westerners. So in the end, the argument which Allied command made for the use of the atomic bomb was that though it may not necessarily discriminate or allow for the immunity of non-combatants, that it would offer a means of easing the proportionality. That though it may seem a large and immediate effect, it would not be as great as an effect as the invasion, the next favorite option, was feared to be. The issue with much of this, as with any war, is the issue that comes from what is known as the doctrine of double effect. Double effect is the understanding that an action, even if pursued with good reason, with good intention, and even for a good effect, can still have a bad or evil effect that comes from it. So obviously, the case of war in general, though war can be pursued and should be pursued for the restoration of justice, the restoration of peace, that usually comes at the cost of people dying, people being actively killed on both sides, usually not one or the other, but both sides. Remember, the three parts of a free intentional act: the intention, the object, the circumstances. Even if the intention remains right, remains true, the object itself can still have that negative effect. Besides war, what might be a classic example of a double effect? Something that can be done that for good, but can still result in some evil. Any ideas?
What comes to mind first happened with the stock market a couple weeks back. And in a way that it kind of exposed the hand of hedge fund managers, but at the same time it harmed people who have other investments in the market, kind of tanked it a little bit.
That might not be a bad example, but that's not the example I'm thinking of. But that might be another way to look into double effect as well. The classic example I think of with double effect is the example of self-defense or defense of the home. So what happens? You and your family are home at night, resting. Someone breaks into the home. Someone breaks into the home for some reason, whether to rob you, whether perhaps even actually to kill you. I doubt that's normally the case, but at least there's something to do something evil themselves. You hear the noise, you go down and you confront this person. You, being perhaps a good old American, have your trusty sidearm with you for your protection, as is according to the Constitution and the laws, and your rights and ability to do so. But in the midst of it, the person spooks you, and you shoot them. And they die because of your shot. That's a classic example of double effect. You are doing what you can to protect your home, but in the midst of that, someone does die because of your actions. So, how can something still be good or still have be considered good if there is a double effect to it? If there's still some evil that happens because of it. 3 ways to do that. First of all, a good intention. There must be a good intention behind it all. So in the example of self-defense, it is good, it is just to protect you and your family from someone who is threatening you. It is. There's nothing immoral about that. Versus if you were in the opposite instance. If you are invading someone's home, that is not a good intention. So there must maintain a good intention in the midst of double effect. That which is bad or evil is not the means to the good effect. So since but the double effect, there is a good effect and a bad effect. That which is bad is not directly the means to the good effect. Lastly, the good must outweigh the bad effect. So for most people who have a firearm to try to defend themselves, their goal is not necessarily to kill someone. Most have that as a means of having power in that instance to be able to pressure someone to stop doing what they're doing. So in that instance of protecting yourself from a home invader, that you show that and say, look, I have more firepower than you. Leave the premise. For most, the intention is not, I am going to murder someone who comes into my home. No, it's I'm going to protect them, and this means to help protect them. I do not necessarily want to kill someone with it, but if it comes down to that, I must do that. Fine. The good must outweigh the bad. What is the good? Self-preservation. In the classic example of self-defense or home defense, you have a right to preserve your life. You do. Someone threatens you. You have the right. You have the duty even, not only to protect and preserve yourselves, but even those you are responsible for. So if you're married, you have children, or if you have, people living in your household, you have a duty to do that for them. So this is why, in the cases of self-defense, we don't charge those people with murder. If we can prove that they meet all the qualifications for double effect. Yes, something bad happened. Can't deny that. Someone was injured or injured greatly to the point of death. But at the same time, the good that they were pursuing is such that it mitigates the responsibility. So, can we apply this principle of double effect to the atomic bomb, to the use of the bombs in those specific cases in Japan? So you are correct in saying Hiroshima was used in some ways as a military base and as a means of a place of a lot of military factories and facilities. That is absolutely correct with Hiroshima. That is not correct with Nagasaki. Nagasaki was not in any way a major military city. Yes, there were some factories there, but not to the extent of Hiroshima, for example. So it is rather unclear the purpose behind choosing Nagasaki. Hiroshima seems a little bit more obvious. This is not perhaps the only instance of heavy destruction of cities in World War II. It's perhaps the most famous one, because obviously classes like ours, morality or history, it's brought up the most, but it's not the only example. The Allies had conventional means to do this, even without the atomic bomb. And the greatest instance of this is what's known as the firebombing of the German city of Dresden in February of 1945. Dresden was considered a military target. It was a center for rail transportation. It was a great communications center as well. There were also numerous factories that were used for the Nazi war effort. What they did was not to use the atomic bomb because it was not completed at that point. This is February of 45. The atomic bombs were used in August. They use incendiary weapons and tactics of using the wind or using the planes, and these are propeller planes and whatnot, to basically create almost a forest fire type situation that destroyed most of the town. Over 90% of the city was destroyed. There are estimates of between 22 and 25,000 people who were killed in that bombing. Many of them due to fire, many of them due to lack of oxygen, because the conditions were such that the fire would just eliminate oxygen in many pockets of like buildings and whatnot. So people suffocated. When the firebombing of Dresden became public in Allied media, many seriously questioned this use of the military on civilian targets in the European front. Scholars, religious authorities, and whatnot. It's really the last sort of evidence of this major usage of this in Europe in World War II. Obviously in Europe, because we talk about this in the Pacific front, the Japanese front. Why is it though that many see the atomic bomb as so great? Or perhaps so well? Obviously there are some of the justifications that we looked at. One perhaps is the great distance that there is between what actually happened. And this can especially be for us in a more virtual age. It's one thing for us to see another person face to face and to have to shoot them, kill them. It's another to know that I have this weapon and I need to send it far away and it's going to kill people, but I don't have to actually see it. I don't have to actually see it happen. Another one could perhaps be the extremes of perhaps the American spirit, great jingo attitude, my country, right or wrong. But yet more and more, the evidence seems to suggest there really was no need to actually use the atomic bomb. Not just in posterity, hindsight's 2020 very easily said. No, even in the midst of the evidence that comes from that time, from the arguments made in strategic command, from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey that was done in 1946, so this is within a year, that the argument is made based on a detailed investigation of all the facts and supported by the testimony of surviving leaders, the survey's opinion that certainly prior to the end of 1945, and all probably prior to November 1st, 1945, Japan would have surrendered even if the bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war. There was another argument also. And even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated. Based off of the testimony of many of those who were involved in the leadership, there was already a struggle within Japanese leadership. There were beginning to be signs that they were done with the war, even as there were some who wanted it to continue to its bitter end. The Supreme Commander for the European forces, Dwight Eisenhower, who would later become President of the United States, recalls in some of his memoirs, he talks about in 1945, the Secretary of War for the United States visited him in Europe, told him that the government has this weapon, has this bomb, this massive bomb, and that they were going to drop it on Japan. Eisenhower writes, I was one of those who felt that there were a number of cogent reasons to question the wisdom of such an act. I had been conscious, he says, during all of this information, I've been conscious of a feeling of depression, and so I voiced to the Secretary my grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated, and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary, and secondly, because I thought that our country should avoid shocking world opinion by the use of a weapon whose employment was, I thought, no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives. The use of the atomic bomb is the most extreme example of judgment of conduct in war. It is not the only one that should be judged, of course. Of course, there is the conduct of many Americans against Vietnamese in the midst of the Vietnam War. Relentlessly targeting civilians because of that same sort of attitude. Well, these are foreigners, they think differently than us. Any of them can be a combatant. So throwing out discrimination or immunity, even at times throwing out proportionality. Sometimes war is necessary, yes. Sometimes it has to happen. We understand the principle of double effect shows that. But at the same time, that does not justify us doing anything and everything. In fact, even though the atomic bomb has become so prevalent in military forces, at least, incredibly, it has never been used in military combat since then. Nor has it even been used by terrorists. We're coming up on the 20th anniversary of the attacks of September 11th. The Al-Qaeda operatives did not try to steal any sort of atomic bomb from out of the midst of Russia, which could, in some certain arguments, is probably not that difficult to do. They used planes as weapons. Bad in and of itself. I don't want to make it sound like I'm praising them for that. But it's incredible they did not even use an atomic bomb. Many have worried about that since then. They've been worried about a dirty bomb or things like that. But yet, it has never been used in actively targeting individuals, whether soldiers, combatants. It has not been used since 1945. Most recognize the immense cost, the immense impact of the bomb. And even if they may say, there is, to use a discriminating abortion, it has still been avoided. Pray to God, hopefully it remains avoided for the rest of our lives, at least. Questions, thoughts, comments about that at this point? All right, for next class, read the document that is linked on Canvas, looking at how it is we participate in politics in the midst of morality. Part of justice is seeing how we can mete out justice, not through war, but through more peaceful means, usually politics. How is it that we can look at and do all of that in the midst of politics? So read up on that, and we'll talk about that next class.